I'm Professor Saul David, and this evening I'm going to be talking to Antony about his new book. Here it is, Russia, Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 1921, and also about his wider career as a historian. As this event is exclusive to you, the Telegraph subscribers, I want to thank you all for attending this evening. A quick bit of housekeeping before we begin. You can make the video full screen by clicking on the square on the bottom right, and you can submit questions if you scroll down to the Q&A box, and these will be fed through to me, and we'll get on to those as the talk continues. So let's begin with the first question. Antony, you've written extensively on World War II and the Spanish Civil War. What drew you back to the Russian Revolution and the Civil War that followed?
Well, I always knew that one had to understand the Russian Revolution and Civil War if one was going to understand the Second World War, because the whole clash between Reds and Whites and the horrors of the war, the destruction, caused such an effect right across Europe, in fact beyond, across the world, that this was the origins in many ways of the great dichotomy between communism and fascism. And therefore, in its way, it was actually one of the most influential events of the whole of the 20th century. It was inevitably a product of the First World War. I mean, during the First World War, people in Russia knew either it was going to come at the end of the war or it might even come just before it, but there was no doubt that it was coming. But the consequences, as I say, were virtually global. And so that was one thing which always struck me. But funny enough, and thank goodness, back in 1990, I was actually seriously tempted by the idea of doing a book covering all of the different civil wars in Europe, which followed the First World War, the Hungarian Revolution, the German Revolution, which of course petered out both in Munich and in Berlin, the Finnish Civil War and so forth. And actually, I wouldn't have been capable of doing justice to it. And then in any case, actually, the Russian archives weren't open at the time. So I was persuaded to do another book, and that was a very, very fortunate thing. And I wouldn't, as I say, I wouldn't have done justice to it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about the sources. Of course, you know, one of the great underpinnings of your I suppose the book that really brought you to public notice as a historian, Stalingrad, was based on the opening up of the archives. Absolutely. After the end of the Soviet Empire.
Incredible luck and timing. Pikoya, who was the Minister of the Archives appointed by Yeltsin, forced the military, who were in a state of shock, to open their archives to foreigners, and they didn't know what to do. Luba and I, now I should say straight away, the book is dedicated to Luba Vinogradova, who I've worked with since those days. 1994 we started together working on Stalingrad in Moscow. And so, we had to negotiate at the Ministry of Defense with this Colonel Romanovs, who said, we have a simple rule in our archive, we choose the files. You couldn't say to him, well, actually, Colonel, that's not how it works in other archives or anything like that. They were in charge. But as I say, there was this fascinating combination of both paranoia and naivety. And gradually we learned how to get round some of the barriers or the barricades. But it was a fascinating time, that period of the 90s of very, very, of great nervousness in official circles, because they just didn't know how to handle this situation.
Now, the downside, of course, of the prominence of both Stalingrad and possibly even more so Berlin, which was a follow-up book, is that your, how can I put it, your sort of rather frank account of what had happened in both those engagements did not go down terribly well with the Russian authorities after the event, so to speak, after the books were published. And so that has made it slightly tricky for you to visit Russian archives today, hasn't it? So the question is, how did you get all these wonderful sources for this current book?
Well, it was actually, Stalingrad was all right. Actually, the veterans of Stalingrad, I started getting messages from their association and all the rest of it, and they very much approved of the book. There were one or two old Stalinist historians who were unhappy. Okay, that was all right. As far as the Berlin book was concerned, yes, I was condemned for lies, slander, and blasphemy against the Red Army. And then Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, brought in this law saying that technically I was, technically anybody who slandered the Red Army, and I was always labelled as the chief slanderer, was liable to 5 years imprisonment. So I don't think anything would necessarily have happened, but at the same time, it would have been very silly to take the risk. But the wonderful thing was that Luba, as I say, was 21 when we started working. To have her PhD, her doctorate was in plant biology. I mean, what I wanted was somebody who had an instinct. And my God, Luba had the best nose possible of immediately spotting what was important, what was vital, and also what really brought life together. I mean, really brought the sort of humanity of the moment together. And we've worked together now off and on over 28 years, ever since then. And it was entirely due to her. She was even working in the archives long before I finished my previous book. We had a good idea of what the future was going to hold, and this was the time to do it. And actually, she was under much less, shall we say, pressure. We had this wonderful friend, a professor, a Russian professor, who used to give her a letter to say that she was working for him, so that she wasn't necessarily associated to me. But as I say, the book is dedicated to her, and it would never have stood a chance without the incredible work that she did over the last 5 years.
So she's been digging away in the archives all over them. I mean, I had a look at the list of archives. I mean, it's all over Russia, isn't it?
Well, she did a lot of travelling around, but the majority of them are Moscow, and one of the most important, actually, funny enough, of the naval archives in Petersburg, where, of course, the Red Navy sailors from the Baltic Fleet played a very large role as sort of marine infantry on the Red side.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get to the specifics of this book, and you begin, of course, as you have to begin a book of this type, of the revolution and the civil war that follows, with an account of how the revolution comes about. You assess very fairly, I think, but quite bluntly, the character of Tsar Nicholas II. But even more interesting, I think, for me, was the depiction of the grimness of circumstances, not just for the Russian civilians, which is reasonably well known from other books, but the soldiers too, and in particular the Cossacks. And it reminded me that actually, for an army to change sides and for a revolution to succeed, you generally, if not always, need some of the original either police or army going onto the side of the revolutionary. So was this an important factor, really? And can you explain a little bit of the sort of conditions I'm talking about, Antony?
Absolutely. I mean, you're quite right. The Cossacks were seen very much as sort of the Tsarist Praetorian Guard. In the 1905 revolution or revolt, rebellion, and uprisings, the Cossacks have been instrumental in crushing any of the demonstrations, and pretty brutally too. So as a result, the workers, the left, the revolutionists were astonished when they suddenly started to sense that the Cossacks were no longer automatically on the side of the Tsar. The ones they really hated were the police in their sort of black Astrakhan uniforms and so forth. And they were the ones who they would pull down and murder and really put an end to in a very brutal way, while the Cossacks would sort of let them come through, and in some cases even stop the police from fighting them. So you're absolutely right, this is a crucial moment. And there was this one little bit which again Luba found of when these soldiers, some Cossacks were billeted in one of the garrisons, and the soldiers said, are you going to fight for the Tsar still again? And they said, pointed at the food they were being shown, which was basically lentils and rotten herring, and they said, do you think we're going to fight? Do you think we're going to fight when we're fed like this? And you started to realize the sort of the frustration, the anger which had built up. But also there's another very important point about the whole question of a revolution, an overthrow of a government. It depends far more not just on the active elements, but also on the degree of apathy amongst the rest. And this is where Lenin and Trotsky were sort of, not in any way sort of a daggers drawn, but I mean, Trotsky was well aware how few real activists they had within the vast Petrograd garrison. It was huge. And felt that that wasn't a guarantee. I think Lenin showed probably a better nose that maybe they were going to be, they would just prefer not to have anything to do with it, and then they'd pick their own side later. And that very much proved to be the case.
Now, we don't like to think as historians, I would suggest, Antony, that anything's inevitable in history. And
Absolutely.
yet, given the character of Nicholas II and the appalling conditions in Russia,
Yes.
and the unwillingness, frankly, to allow any kind of significant political change, you could argue that this is as close as inevitability gets, could you not?
I can't help laughing at all because I actually have a weasel phrase to get round the great order to all historians. You're never allowed to use the word inevitable. I say it's very hard to imagine how another set of circumstances could have come about.
Yeah.
And that's the only way that one can sort of phrase it there. It is very hard. There were possibilities that, if they had brought in one of the cavalry corps from, the Southwest Front or whatever in time, which they were planning to do, but there was a sort of a German attack and so they didn't move them. You might have had, therefore, some disciplined soldiers. Because let's face it, most of the Bolsheviks themselves never thought that this was going to happen. And, the 1917 revolt, of course, happened when Lenin and all the other leaders hadn't even come back to the country.
Yeah.
Obviously, we were talking about the October Revolution just earlier then. But in this particular point, none of the Bolsheviks really believed that this was going to be the overthrow. And the astonishment amongst the exiles in Switzerland was unbelievable.
You get the famous story of the Germans seeing their opportunity after the February Revolution. I think we should just stress, if people aren't particularly aware of the history here, is that, as you're pointing out, Anthony, the first revolution brings in a provisional government with the so-called moderates. I'm not sure how moderate they were, but anyway, the so-called moderates. And it's only the October Revolution that brings in the Bolsheviks and the communists. So you get this interesting period in between. And I've got two thoughts here. But the first question is, the Germans very ruthlessly and pragmatically make it possible for Lenin, who they know is quite a serious revolutionary, quite extreme, to get back into Russia and cause trouble. In a sense, did they eventually bite off more than they could chew by doing that? With the benefit of hindsight, was that a mistake by the Germans, do you think?
No, not at all, because basically that led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of the following year, which was actually the Germans' greatest achievement in the whole of the First World War, because it allowed them to occupy a large part of all of Belarus, most of Western Russia, and of course Ukraine, because cities were starving, and above all, the Austro-Hungarian cities were starving and were about to collapse. So they kept the war going on that particular basis. I think it was a disaster for the Allies in a way, but anyway, the Germans were able to then move all their troops over to the Western Front for the Great Ludendorff Offensive. So it had a huge knock-on effect in that particular way. So Lenin's voyage or trip in the so-called SEAL train, where even Lenin, shall we say, a micromanager, had ordered the toilet routine for everybody on the train, which was, I thought, sort of interesting little detail of sort of mental detail. But these are terribly important, I think, in history.
Yeah.
But it also meant, though, that they had this really powerful leadership. Let's face it, I don't think that the October Revolution would have worked without Lenin and his determination. Most of the other Bolsheviks were horrified by what they thought the recklessness of his plan. So it also undermines sort of the great Tolstoyan idea that, forget the great man theory of history. The great man theory of history is there written very, very large, because without Lenin, certainly without Trotsky, would the Reds have won? So, inevitability, I think, is something which we don't have to worry about too much in that particular way.
Lenin and Trotsky, as you say, are driving events to a certain extent during that crucial period between February and October. Was there an opportunity for the moderates, the provisional government, eventually Kerensky, to have produced a different type of government and therefore a very different Russia in a different 20th century?
Well, the trouble was that, of course, the February Revolution, and above all the destruction of the police, meant that they didn't control the cities anymore. It meant that the land captains in the countryside were chased away or killed. And actually, the provisional government, one has to remember, it was, if you like, slightly double-headed. It was curious. You get rid of the Romanovs, and then you have this double-headed organisation of basically the provisional government of moderate liberals, where Kerensky was a member, but he was also a member of the Petrograd Soviet, which was basically socialist. And the two sort of work together very uneasily. But one has to remember that this is what Alexander Herzen described, if you like, in the middle of the 19th century as the pregnant widow. Here you have a new situation where there is no idea of how the future is going to, the new regime cannot be born. And of course, they were totally vulnerable. There were levers, but there was no power attached to the levers of Prince Lvov and others. And I mean, they were so liberal, of course, that they allowed in Trotsky and Lenin and anybody or whatever, because they felt it would be wrong in what was in the democracy that they were about to produce. And to create that democracy, they were going to have elections for the Constituent Assembly, which would follow, like all of the rest of Western Europe, a parliamentary system, which was, of course, then going to be destroyed rapidly, very rapidly, by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, because they wanted to have nothing to do with it.
You mentioned the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Antony. Mm-hmm. This, of course, was the withdrawal of the Russians from the war, the abandonment of their allies. But of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had a very different intention, and that was to gain control of Russia. And so in that sense, it made a lot of sense for what they were doing. But I think we should stress that big chunks of the old Russian Empire were effectively handed over to Germany. And it's interesting when we move on to the Second World War, and I'm digressing a little here, you can see some of the same sort of, the determination to get back some of this land that they lose at the end of the First World War. So my question comes, you get this fillip for the Germans and bad news for the Allies. You get a chance for the Bolsheviks to reassess, so to speak. But then you get the Germans collapsing at the end of the First World War. And this is another significant moment, isn't it, in the Civil War? Because all of a sudden, the Germans withdraw. This means that the Allies maybe are going to step into the vacuum. And so was that a significant moment for the Reds, so to speak, the Bolsheviks?
Well, it was an extremely significant moment, and in fact, not just from the point of view of that period, but I mean for today, we've got to remember the way that Putin was so bitterly attacked Lenin for giving the possibility of self-determination to the component parts, which included Ukraine, Belarus, and of course Finland. Now, Finland managed to grab its opportunity. When I say Finland collectively, actually it was the White Finns who then managed to win their civil war during that particular winter and above all the following year. So Lenin, you see, rather arrogantly thought that it's going to be followed by a world revolution. So we'll get them back under control. We can give them their independence now, but we'll get it back. Well, of course, getting it back, I mean, as we're seeing today with Putin in Ukraine, he wants to reconstitute, really, the Russian Empire, not just the Soviet Union, but actually the Russian Empire.
Now, just moving forward a little, very, very briefly to current events in Ukraine, there's a sort of, some people have argued, and no doubt in Putin's completely misguided history, that this moment is significant, and this is an indication of how the Ukrainians didn't have genuine nationalism, and that this was a sort of opportunity for them to carve their independence, as it were, from Russia. But of course, their sense of nationalism goes back much further than this, doesn't it, Antony?
Yes. No, I mean, they had very much their own literature, their own language to a large degree, particularly out in the countryside and so forth. It wasn't just the intellectuals in Kiev and places like that. The Russians, I mean, if you like, the greater Russians, as they would like to think of themselves, who still referred to Ukrainians as the Little Russians, as opposed to the White Russians for Belarus and so forth, were incredibly sort of, dismissive and contemptuous. And so they didn't take it at all seriously. And there was a certain amount of play acting. I mean, for example, when Petliura tried to sort of make his have a sort of triumphant parade, the only uniforms they could find were Cossack uniforms from the National Theatre, this was sort of regarded as sort of as a little bit ridiculous, but it was the period of the time. They were then chased out when the Reds immediately started sending in under Antonov Ovseyenko to occupy Kiev and as much as they could of Ukraine. And that is when, Ukraine in this particular period then started to become one of the sort of key cockpits of the whole of the Russian Civil War.
Now, in many ways, you look at the book and you think this is about Russia, this is about revolution and civil war, but it's really about Russia, albeit within the context of the old Russian Empire. Actually, it's bigger than that, isn't it? This is almost a global conflict. So, can we talk a little bit about the foreign intervention? We've got at one point the British in the north, Murmansk,
and Archangel,
18,400 men, joined by troops from the US, Canada, France, Serbia, Italy, and other places. So can you explain a little bit? It's complicated, I know, and everyone has slightly different motives, but what were the Allies trying to achieve, and how did it turn out, Antony?
Well, there was a lot of, shall we say, confused thinking, but one's got to picture how things were in Paris. You've got to remember, here is the whole question of, the Versailles Conference. It is the question of the Supreme Allied Command in Paris, and where they were trying to reorganize the whole of Europe. I mean, they'd taken on far too much. Whether it was a question of redrawing the boundaries in different areas, the frontiers. And then, of course, you have Clemenceau, who is a fervent anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik, who is desperate to deploy French troops and French naval forces in the Black Sea. And of course, he's supported very much by Churchill, who's just been appointed Secretary of State for War, who is also keen to seize the opportunity. But at the same time, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, is deeply sceptical about whether anything could be achieved, sometimes for the wrong reasons, but I think in the end his instinct was probably pretty accurate. And Churchill really thought that, if we can arm the white forces who are resisting this red takeover, then, there is a chance that Russia would be able to return to, the community of nations as a democratic organization, as a democratic country, now that the reactionary czars and regime is gone, which again would prove to be, of course, far too optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a chapter called The Fatal Compromise.
Yes.
We think we want to do something, but we're not entirely convinced, and we're not going all in. So can you explain a little bit more about what that fatal compromise was?
Well, the fatal compromise was basically to arm the white forces, but not to send in ground troops.
Yeah.
Okay, they sent in ground troops in certain areas, like, as you rightly said, up in the north. There were a large number in Vladivostok and the Far East, but this was pure opportunism on the part of the Japanese, who at one point had some 85,000 troops landed there. But they wanted to basically try and take over large parts of the maritime provinces of eastern Siberia. The Americans, of course, wanted to land troops because they wanted to keep an eye on the Japanese, who they didn't trust, quite rightly for a moment there. And then you had all of these other different sort of contingents. You had Greeks and Serbs and all the rest of it, particularly down in the south. And it turned out to be totally disastrous because obviously at the end of a long war like the First World War, the troops were war-weary, they were wanted to go home and all the rest of it, and many of them by that stage, of course, had been influenced by communist or very much by revolutionary propaganda. And this is where you get the mutiny of the French Black Sea Fleet and the appalling performance of the French army in Ukraine after landing at Odessa. So I'm afraid it turned into a terrible humiliation for France in that particular way. And even the British were starting to get slightly nervous. They had, should we say, some problems up in the north. But I mean, we were close. At one point, Churchill actually has to admit, this was the closest we came, with mutinies in France of troops wanting to be repatriated, and back in England. And this is where Lloyd George was saying, listen, if you push it too far, we're going to have a revolution in this country, and we can't afford to keep this war going.
Yeah, I mean, backing up that point, you've got a wonderful quote from Lloyd George in which he says, actually, there's a danger. We're going to put some serious reactionaries in power in Russia, and this is not going to go down well here, hence your point about revolution at home. One of the really striking things about the book, and frankly, one of the grimmest aspects of it, but it's history, and we need to understand it, is the sheer scale of atrocities committed by both sides. Now, I just want to read out a very quick quote, because I think this sums this up nicely. I mean, you're quoting a writer called Nazivin, and Nazivin's actually talking to some of the white officers, but he's talking about atrocities. And he says, on both sides, bitterness has reached an extreme inhuman scale. The Reds, once they have taken a stanitsa, plunder everything they can, rape women regardless of their age, and don't spare bullets. The Cossacks, too, are extremely embittered towards the Reds, especially sailors and the Chinese. They whip them to death with metal ramrods, bury them in the ground up to their neck, and then cut off the head with their sabre or castrate them and hang them on the trees in their dozens. Even those who would like to surrender are not surrendering. By exterminating the Reds in this manner, the Whites are often killing friends and potential helpers who were forced to join the ranks of the Reds. Graphic, grim detail. And I suppose the really big question we need to ask ourselves, and I'm specifically asking you now, Antony, in the context of what's happening with atrocities in Ukraine today, is there something particular about the Russian character that can stomach this sort of thing? And does it even go further than that? And will Russian commanders, both in Tsarist armies and red and white armies, and even today, use atrocities as a sort of tactical, method in war?
It goes back a long way. First of all, I think one's got to say that there is no such thing as, say, a national character with a DNA or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And especially in Russia, because one's got to remember that Russia itself has long been split, really ever since almost the time of Peter the Great, but I mean particularly in the 19th century and more recently, between the modernizers who want to be European and the Slavophiles who want the old sort of Muscovite idea of what's much more an Asiatic Russia. Now, I use the word Asiatic carefully here. I mean, this is when, on the first night of the real fighting in Petrograd during the revolution, the great Russian writer, Maxim Gorky, who knew the oppressed working class and, if you like, lumpenproletariat better than any Bolshevik, says to the Menshevik who's with him, Sukhanov, he says, we're going to see with this revolution, we're going to see real Asiatic savagery. Now, the idea of Asiatic savagery in this way, I think, goes back very much to the 13th century and the Mongol invasions, where, as you say, war, conspicuous cruelty was used as a deliberate weapon of war. If a town did not surrender immediately, the retribution, the reprisals were simply appalling. Now, I don't think, though, that any country, as I say, has a national characteristic. But there's always a certain self-image which many people will perhaps adopt. And one of them, obviously, is that war is brutal, and a very casual attitude towards savagery develops as a result. And I think that is true of Russia. We've seen it, obviously, here very much in the Russian Civil War. We certainly saw it in, shall we say, the retribution exerted on Germany in 1945. With the mass rapes and a lot of the killing and slaughter then, which was one's only got to read Solzhenitsyn and others and descriptions of what was happening. And we are seeing it in Ukraine from all of the reports that we're getting. It is a sort of terrifying repetition. So, yes, maybe there is something which it's not necessarily genetically inherent, but it has obviously developed as an attitude. And when one sees the way that the recruits have been treat it. I mean, I remember at one stage in the early 90s, there were 5,000 suicides a year amongst the young recruits sent. And this became a joke amongst the senior officers. So, I mean, it gives you an idea, I think, of the sort of the dehumanization, which, again, we have been seeing, the way that their bodies have not been repatriated, they've just simply been hidden or buried. And it's a question of really also the cynicism of their leaders, particularly like Putin, who will treat their own people as almost as badly as their enemies.
Yeah, it's
Stalin.
I don't know if you saw it in the papers today, Anthony. Absolutely striking. Quite a senior diplomat coming out with, what is happening is utterly disgraceful. It's the first time at least I have acknowledged or I'm aware of such a senior figure in the Foreign Office saying this is absolute madness what we're doing here, and it's an utter disgrace. So anyway, we need a few more voices like that, frankly, to speak out. So back to the story. There's some wonderful pen portraits of the leading figures on both sides. Lenin, obviously, Chushinsky, this extraordinary Pole who's leading the Cheka, the secret police, swinging between, real utter ruthlessness and then guilt at what he's done. I mean, he says at one point, just shoot me, doesn't he? I can't live with myself.
Yes, you see, the interesting thing is, I mean, he was somebody who was incredibly austere and never drank. And then on that sort of New Year's Eve night, somebody had started giving him drinks and he got completely drunk. And he said, shoot me, I don't deserve to live. I've spilled too much blood. Yeah. But he also was aware of the way that his operatives in the Cheka, in the secret police, were becoming completely demoralized and even mad and unhinged by the blood and the slaughter. And this actually was repeated by Himmler in the invasion of 41 and 42, when Himmler started to suddenly become concerned, and that was one of his main reasons for switching from the Shoah by bullet to the Shoah by gas, so as to save his own men because of the slaughter they were going through. So, I mean, I'm afraid the sort of the horrors and so forth are an important part of the story, but they're obviously not the whole story, but they are a very vital element of the Civil War.
On the other side, of course, you do the same for the white generals, people like Denikin, Wrangel, Kolchak. Was there anyone after you'd finished writing that rose in your estimation as a character, as an operator, even as a general, as opposed to your views beforehand?
Oh no, there were one or two. I mean, but they were quite outstanding. They were quite outstanding in their own particular way. There were one or two who were actually very effective generals, but ghastly people. I mean, General Maimaevsky, who there was the immensely obese general, but he was actually very, very clever indeed. Shkuro, who was actually funny enough, he was handed back by the Allies, by the British, in fact, in Carinthia, to the Soviets, and he, of course, was executed by Stalin or by the NKVD, or actually by Smersh. So, I mean, there were not many who, shall we say, deserved their fate, but there were one or two on the white side who actually served, who were actually admired, but they were entirely exceptions. Most of them were maniacs, but they are fascinating maniacs in their own particular way. I have to say, the Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, who sort of lived this extraordinary life as a Buddhist and in Mongolia, but was sort of fighting an obsessive anti-Semite, an obsessive anti-Soviet. He met a pretty sticky end too, as an executed. So yes, there are a lot of shall we say, there are a lot of bizarre stories too. Yeah.
Now we know how it turns out, of course, with a red victory, but the counter-revolutionaries, the whites, actually saw a certain amount of early success, didn't they? And moving on even into 1919 with the at least the Denikin's attempted drive on Moscow, did the whites, do you think, ever have a realistic chance of winning the Civil War?
The Eurasian landmass was so huge that you could advance very rapidly. and then, of course, lose any form of sort of logistic support, and the whole advance would collapse. So that's why we see these extraordinary swings during late 1918 and early 1919. The trouble with the Whites was they couldn't coordinate their attacks. You have Denikin in the south, you have Kolchak in Siberia, and Yudenich up in the Baltic zone, the Baltic region. And they could never sort of, get their acts together. They treated their allies abominably, so they couldn't get the Poles or the Finns to support them at key moments when they could have might have achieved something, but the obsession with sort of the old reconstituting the old Russian Empire was not going to help them at all, to Churchill's total frustration, as you might imagine. And the other thing was, of course, that the Bolsheviks were based in Moscow and having that sort of central Western Russian area of large cities and so forth. Both A, had the manpower, and B, had the communications and the arms factories. So and above all, they had internal lines. So they were able to reinforce different fronts and make use of their forces far more effectively. But it was basically the Whites never stood a chance. A, because of it was a totally improbable alliance between moderate socialists and extreme reactionaries. And the moderate socialists simply, not surprisingly, couldn't trust the extreme reactionaries, who eventually, because they were the soldiers, were the ones who were going to take power, and treated administration as a means of enriching themselves. So utter corruption, total brutality towards the peasants, and as a result, they were never going to get the support they needed, and faced huge guerrilla attacks and in the rear during that particular critical period of 1919 in the so-called Great Advance, the Great March on Moscow.
I mean, so they ultimately win. Lenin's endgame, as you've already pointed out, is to export communism, Bolshevism, to the rest of Europe. Does the Bolsheviks' defeat outside Warsaw by the Poles, does that save the rest of Europe from communism at that stage in history?
Well, I think so. It's often been cited as one of the great decisive victories or great decisive battles, certain of the modern era. But again, we're into the sort of what-if area, because probably even if Tukhachevsky, who was sort of commanding there, even if Pilsudski, the Polish leader, had not managed that great counterattack at that particular moment, would they then have still had the chance to fight on into Germany, and would the German revolutionaries have actually been able to overthrow the Freikorps of that particular period? I doubt it, but at the same time, this was very much the key moment for, if you like, the idea of this sort of Europe, if you like, Western Europe versus sort of the communist East.
Antony, we can't end my questions without a little bit of talk. What happens next? You've had a long and very illustrious career as a historian. What are your plans now after this book? This is a big book.
I'm not changing career at all. I mean, when you say what happens next. For the moment, I'm just going to carry on preparing one or two ideas to see where to go next. But this one has been quite a big book, and required a lot of effort. And anyway, it's that wonderful moment when it's finally sort of there, and you see the result of all that work, and especially all that fantastic work from Luba Vinogradova.
I think what the listeners will maybe not be aware of is the amount of work actually historians like you have to put into the book once it's produced. So we'd like to think, well, you've done the hard work and this is the easy bit, but actually there's a long hard road selling books. I think it's fair to say.
Well, I'm saying incredibly lucky because there are so many foreign translations, and that's so it's a question of sort of doing at least about 8 countries in Europe in the autumn. As the different translations come out. But I mean, let's face it, anyway, the real ratio, of course, is the research, the research to the writing. The writing actually is the sort of, in a way, the enjoyable part, I think, but it's the amassing of the material which is the vital part.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to some questions from the audience, and we've got quite a few, so I'll try and get through as many as I can. Now, this first one's from someone called Ron, and he says, "My mother was 8 when the Reds entered Odessa. In 1919, her family fled, chased by the Cheka. They had farm estates north of Odessa and held the Mercedes Agency. Can you please say something about how your book covers Odessa in this period? I seek new evidence I can quote in my biography of my family's escape." Can you help?
Well, there's quite a bit about Odessa. Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, Odessa is a fascinating city because it's such a mixture, or was certainly such a mixture at the time. It was also the scene of, as I mentioned earlier, the French landings and so forth, and a very, very important port. So from that point of view, it was regarded as vital to the British and French allies at that stage. But the trouble was that the Whites had only a small detachment of the volunteer army there, and the French refused to deal with them. And in fact, the French were far more sympathetic to Petlura and the Ukrainian nationalists. So from that point of view, there was a lot of sort of rivalry, there was a lot of miscommunication. But because simply of the sheer scope of the book, the sheer landmass and of the Eurasian landmass or whatever, it's not entirely about Odessa, I can assure you, the whole book. But there's quite a bit about it which I hope you'll find, Ron, interesting.
Okay, here's a question from Nigel. Given that the British government provided material aid for the White Army, why didn't we do more to provide a safe haven for the Romanovs? Was it simply to do with not wanting to involve our royal family, which has been the traditional explanation?
Well, that has been the traditional explanation. A lot of it also is a question of timing. The problem was that nobody really saw when Kerensky made the decision to send them to Siberia, first of all to Tobolsk, long before they went to Ekaterinburg. It didn't look so dangerous. This is, remember, before the Bolshevik Revolution. But then, by the time they were away, they were literally out of reach. And the only way of actually getting to them or of saving them would have been the advance from the Far East or from along the Trans-Siberian of Czech forces combined with white forces and some of the Allies. But they still did manage to get out quite a few from Crimea. HMS Marlborough took off, the Dowager Empress and others and so forth. We do not really I don't think we still know the full story of to what degree the government at the time was panic-stricken by the prospect of a revolution in Britain and felt that to bring the Romanovs straight back to England was going to be a sort of a catastrophic mistake. So I don't get deeply involved in that particular one because actually it's quite a saga in itself, and I still think there's probably more material to come out of the Royal Archives at Windsor.
Okay, did the Bolsheviks succeed because they did what good Tsars managed to achieve, and that's expand from a Muscovite central area and take territory from disparate opponents? I think you sort of answered that question, but maybe you can expand a little bit on that, Antony.
Well, I think there was always that idea. I fear that I don't think that sort of Lenin had, like Putin has, sort of an idea of sort of imitating the old Kievan Rus and all of that stuff. I mean, Putin's idea of history is very bizarre. As far as Lenin was concerned, he was not obsessed with the past. What he wanted to do was to bulldoze the past completely, to destroy it, so that it could never return. And that was where he was so thrilled by the destruction created in the countryside by the peasants, the killing of landowners and the destruction of estates. And so from that point of view, no, Putin was very much sort of keener on the idea of basically a world revolution. He sensed that Russia on its own would have a tough time in bringing in its own version of communism, unless it was going to be supported, because otherwise it would be at war with the rest of the world. So it was, you could say that was sort of messianic, or even a sort of form of megalomania, but at the same time there was a certain logic to go with it.
Okay, here's an interesting one. Did the Bolshevik armies benefit from any ex-Tsarist senior officers who joined them?
Hugely, hugely. I mean, I'm sorry, I can't remember the total figure off the top of my head.
Lots of thousands.
But I mean, yes, many, many thousands. And even some of the most distinguished, like Brusilov, who commanded the 1916, the great offensive of 1916. Tukashevsky had been a guards officer. Some of their most important ones actually were Kamenev, another one, Sergei Kamenev, not Lev. And so, yes, a vast number who. It came in two stages. One was basically they were either blackmailed into it, or they had relatives, or basically they felt that they had sort of, little choice. Others, of course, were sort of opportunists, realizing it was the only way to survive. But then when you come to the Polish War, Poland had always been seen almost as a traditional enemy of Russia. There was a huge volunteering from Red Army officers, from white former Tsarist officers, joining. But at the crucial moment, and I think this is one of the things which I hadn't realized enough when I started the book, was how few Tsarist officers actually fought against the Bolshevik takeover in October 1917, because even sort of 5,000 of them could have made the difference in Petrograd, but they were in such a state of apathy and irritation and exasperation with the Romanovs that they hardly thought it was worth sort of raising the effort.
Here's an interesting one. How great an impact...
Should we have the name of the...
Yes, sorry, this is anonymous, actually, so that was probably why.
Oh, right.
This is anonymous. How great an impact did Trotsky have upon the military strategic course of the Civil War?
Well, he obviously had a huge. He was as a sort of commander in chief and so forth, and sort of Somnaukom's sort of head military head. But at the same time, there were factions, and of course the opposing faction was basically sort of Kamenev, supported by Stalin. And others. The big debate over strategy, which Trotsky lost, was whether they should deal with Denikin first in 1918 and finish him off down in the south, the armed forces of southern Russia, when Stalin, Kamenev, and others argued that Kolchak was the one who had to be finished off first. And in fact, I think that was probably the right decision, because they would then, with the Trans-Siberian Railway, they could be able to bring back their troops quite rapidly once the Kolchak's lot had been sort of basically put to flight. And that is more or less what happened in 1919. Churchill could not understand when in the early autumn of 1919, Denikin's forces were there, almost not within striking distance, but I mean only about less than 200 miles from Moscow. And everybody thought, this is the end of the Bolshevik regime, and Lenin's about to flee to Finland or wherever, or Murmansk or whatever. The rumours were running in every direction. And Churchill couldn't believe when the sudden turnaround, when you reach that point, that cumulative point in sort of military history, when they had run out of, lost the initiative, and basically they were running out of supplies, they had run out of supplies, and suddenly they were totally vulnerable. And this is when the Reds were also very, very clever in the way that they offered amnesties to all the deserters, because the desertion on both sides was massive. And people were just rounding up peasants who had been in the Red Army or the White Army or whatever, and they were back in their forces. And most of the recruits in both sides had actually already fought on the other side. I mean, it was extraordinary in that sense.
Okay, here's a question from Nick. And Nick asks, if the Romanovs hadn't been murdered in July 1918, what do you think would have happened to them?
Very hard to reply on that particular one. If they hadn't been murdered, but I mean the problem was that I think that the Lenin, the order, it wasn't a question that this was just a local decision. Yeah. I think that most of the research has now shown that this was very definitely an order from Lenin. Mm-hmm. Again, it was part of his policy, his strategy to destroy the past so that it could never come back. And it wasn't just a question of, the imperial family in Ekaterinburg. It was all the other Grand Dukes who were held in other cities in the same region, who again also were shot and thrown down mine shafts and all the rest of it. No, I don't think they stood a chance of survival in those circumstances, because the whole Civil War had got to this particular point that it was all or nothing, and therefore you had the right to sort of kill anybody who might be a potential danger in the future.
Did they actually have an opportunity to get out? Was there any ever a time where they could have got out in safety?
Some of them did. I mean, there was no shortage of Grand Dukes and so forth, but I mean, quite a few did get out, usually through the south. That was their opportunity.
Yeah.
But those who'd been sent to Siberia were in a far more difficult position, because obviously the exit points were simply not there.
Okay. Now, this is from Heidi. It's an educational question. Dear Sir Antony, my 15-year-old teenager is studying the Russian Revolution for GCSE and finds the subject fiendishly difficult to get to grips with. Do you have any tips for entry-level understanding? Are there any documentaries or films, for example, you'd recommend?
I don't think necessarily a documentaries. I haven't actually ever seen a really good documentary. One of the reasons for this, of course, is, if you like, the lack of footage. Documentaries is, I mean, you and I both know perfectly well from our careers that, documentaries depend on the footage, and if you haven't got it, and the trouble is that quite often what they do is, if they do use any footage, it's absolutely totally false, like all of the Eisenstein films of sort of, the storming of the Winter Palace. It was nothing like that, but they just simply take it out of Soviet propaganda films. So no, rule out that. I think that it's a question of basically one or two fairly straightforward. Wolsey did a very good book, a short book on the Russian Revolution and Civil War. I think. Well, of course, I mean, I do try and clarify things, I hope, as much as I possibly can in this particular one, because it is actually, although very, very complicated on the surface, it is actually a fascinating story when you start to see the way that the whole the sort of the power games, the way that power switch from one side to another or to different people, it actually does become clearer. It does have its own particular logic. But I'm afraid, by definition, civil wars are almost always more complicated than a conventional state-on-state war.
Is it occasionally worth recommending fiction, even films? And obviously I'm thinking of Dr. Zhivago. When we last spoke about this, I mentioned it to you, Antony, and I asked you the extent to which there was accuracy in that book, and you said, well, it gives a flavour of
the Civil War. I mean, I love Dr. Zhivago as a book. The film, the film, shall we say, a very Anglo version. I think the Russians are always very contemptuous. I mean, as for sort of, our attempt to sort of do Eugene Onegin in film or anything like that, I'm afraid the Russians sort of spit with anger. I think the book, the novel, is simply a wonderful novel in its own particular way. So, but it's not a history. It'll give you an idea of the atmosphere of the time and so forth, and the attitudes, and above all, the sort of the disbelief of so many people that these events could be happening, that the world could change so much in such a short space of time. And I think that's one of its sort of really powerful aspects.
Okay, time for, I think, a couple more questions. Here's the first one. Do you consider, this is anonymous again, do you consider the Russian Civil War as laying the foundations for the later Stalinist centralized repressive state? Was it possible for Lenin to have taken a different route post-1921?
Well, Lenin, by the time he was starting to get ill, I don't think that Lenin could have taken or would have taken it. I mean, Lenin had total contempt, I'm afraid, for almost anybody who disagreed with him. And he certainly, the idea that Lenin could suddenly have become more democratic, or sort of believed in. I mean, he'd made one opportunistic attempt when he brought in the left socialist revolutionaries, but that was a very clever move on his particular part. It wasn't because he actually believed in any form of pluralism or anything like that. He despised pluralism. He despised democracy in every form or kind. So I'm afraid that sort of, if you like, after the Kaplan attempted assassination of Lenin, and then later with his illness, Stalin and the start of the personality cult, when sort of Lenin was turned into a godlike figure in the Soviet Union, and his basically stroke, the state that he was in, once Stalin was going to take over with his intentions, his hatred for Trotsky, his hatred for all of the Bolsheviks who despised him as a Georgian bandit, a pockmarked Georgian bandit. Stalin was going to take his revenge on all of those sort of Bolshevik intellectuals who'd looked down on him. And of course, to a certain degree, Lenin was one of them. I mean, he just thought that Stalin was very, very useful, but he totally underestimated, as certainly did Trotsky, Stalin's capacity for maneuver and backstairs politics, and he was brilliant when it came to that.
Last question, anonymous again. Could you say a few words about John Keegan?
Oh, absolutely. Well, John was somebody who I owed a great deal to. I studied under him at Sandhurst, and I think that we all owe John a huge debt in the way that with that one book, that first book of The Face of Battle, he upended military history. Now, that was military history, and as you and I know, Michael Howard, to whom we bow down, Professor Sir Michael Howard at King's College London, was also incredibly important in his influence, in his argument, in fact, that we shouldn't be military historians, we should be historians of war. Now, The Face of Battle was military history because it was concentrating uniquely on soldiers and their experience. But he turned it upside down for the first time, that history had always been written in a collective way, the history of a country, of an army, or whatever. And John, as I think sort of already one or two other historians were starting to think of, but hadn't really achieved at that particular point, was starting to see that actually one really wanted to look at the experience of the individual. And that is what John achieved there. It was a very important and influential book, and I think it's still his best book by far. John was not a historian who really believed very much in sort of archival research, and he was often teased about that in some ways at conferences and so forth. But his contribution was huge in that particular way. In some ways, I don't think it was quite as great as Michael Howard, who I think has probably been the most important thinker in all defence matters, that we've had in this country, certainly since the Second World War.
Well, I think that brings us almost to a close. So thank you, Antony, for your time. Congratulations again on another wonderful book. The reviews so far have been stellar, I think, as you might have hoped, and let's hope the sales match that. Thanks to all the subscribers for joining us tonight. If you weren't fast enough to get your hands on the original 75 books, you can, of course, buy them at all good bookshops or the Telegraph Bookshop. Please keep an eye out on the Telegraph Extra website for more subscriber exclusive offers, events and competitions. In fact, you might even like to sign up for an online event with Wing Commander David Montenegro to talk about his career as a Red Arrows pilot on the 9th of June. So I'd just like to say once again, thank you to Antony and good night from us all.